Welcome, dear listener to Moonlight Audiobook. Tonight, we invite you into a world of intrigue, where the boundaries of truth and deception blur, and every clue holds a piece of a deeper puzzle. We are about to step into a case that will challenge your mind and test your powers of deduction. In this world of mysteries, where nothing is as it seems, we'll uncover the secrets that lie hidden beneath the surface. As we embark on this journey, I encourage you to relax, to let go of your expectations, and allow your mind to drift into the carefully woven threads of this case. Picture yourself walking alongside a detective, sharp-eyed and sharp-minded, as we piece together each fragment, every tiny detail that leads us closer to the truth. In this space, the rhythm of life may be slower, but the mysteries unfold with a precision that demands attention. Let go of any distractions, and allow the mystery to pull you in. There's no rush here, only the steady unraveling of secrets, one clue at a time. And as we move forward, you'll soon realize, every answer creates more questions, until the final truth is laid bare before you. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where in the world you are watching from. So let's begin. Chapter 1. The autumn evening was a symphony of shadow and light, the last vestiges of daylight slipping away as the cold fingers of dusk tightened their grip on London. Hercule Poirot sat in his apartment, the only warmth coming from the faint golden light of the lamp on his desk. He held a delicate cup of coffee in his hand, the steam curling upward in slow spirals, as though reluctant to leave the comfort of the porcelain. His mind, ever sharp, was at ease, at least until the phone rang. He set the cup down with precise elegance, the soft clink of china breaking the stillness of the room. The call, as always, would demand his attention. Poirot speaking. The voice on the other end of the line was breathless, its tone a jagged mixture of fear and disbelief. "Is this Monsieur Hercule Poirot? I need your help. A terrible crime, too, actually. You must come at once. It's the A.B.C. murders. I believe we're dealing with something far more insidious than we can comprehend." The words landed in Poirot's mind like a stone sinking into a still pool. A.B.C., he mused, an unsettling echo resonating in his thoughts. A code, a sequence, a pattern. It had to be a pattern. His mind immediately began to untangle the strands. "I will come immediately, monsieur," he said, his voice steady as ever, though inside, his instincts sharpened. "Where am I to go?" The caller provided an address in one of London's more fashionable districts, an area where high society mingled, where secrets were kept behind the gilded facades of townhouses. As Poirot hung up, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the case bearing down on him. There was something unsettling about the mention of A.B.C., something that spoke of a deliberate hand, a puzzle waiting to be solved. As he stepped out into the crisp evening air, a faint drizzle began to fall, soft as whispers against his coat. The city around him bustled with life, yet it felt somehow distant, as though the shadows held sway over the streets. His steps were purposeful, each one measured, his mind turning over the details already known and those yet to be uncovered. What was the significance of this? A pattern? A message? Or a deliberate game played by the killer? Arriving at the townhouse, Poirot found it looming in the gathering darkness, its ivy-clad walls seeming to pulse with an eerie life of their own. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of damp earth and the faint trace of perfume. He made his way inside, greeted by a group of guests gathered in the drawing room, their faces pale, their movements unnervingly still. The crime scene was laid bare before him, and Poirot's eyes immediately fell upon the victim. She lay sprawled on the floor, her eyes wide open in shock, her mouth slightly ajar, as if frozen in her final, fleeting moment of terror. Alice Brown, a woman of beauty and grace, was dead, but it was the manner of her death that seized Poirot's attention. The letter had been drawn beside her in crimson, the blood fresh and unsettling against the otherwise pristine floorboards. The pattern was unmistakable. A.B.C, Poirot whispered, though his voice was barely audible. His sharp eyes scanned the scene, noting every detail. The positioning of the body, the placement of the letter, this was no random act. This was a carefully orchestrated crime. The killer had made a statement. He stood for a moment, unmoving, his mind whirring with possibilities. A deliberate crime scene. A pattern. The beginning of something far more disturbing. Poirot could already feel the puzzle forming before him, like a blueprint etched in his mind. The guests around him were silent, their eyes darting nervously toward one another. Some were visibly shaken, their faces pale, while others looked almost too composed, perhaps too composed. They were hiding something. Poirot could sense it, even if they tried to mask it beneath their shock. Poirot moved methodically around the room, his gaze flicking over the details. Nothing escaped him. The faint scent of perfume in the air, the hurried movements of a man adjusting his cufflinks, a slight tremor in the hand of a woman nervously twisting her ring. The room was full of tension, an undercurrent of fear running through each of them. But fear of what? Of the crime? Or of something deeper, something they were all trying to hide? Turning to face the group, Poirot raised his voice just enough to be heard, his tone calm but commanding. I must ask you all to remain calm. No one is to leave this room until I have spoken with each of you. We are dealing with a matter of great delicacy, and I require your full cooperation. There was a ripple of discomfort, but none dared to question his authority. Poirot's gaze swept over the guests, his sharp eyes picking up the slightest twitch in the corner of a man's lip, the brief, almost imperceptible glance exchanged between two women. All these small details, these cracks in their composure, spoke volumes. One of the men in the room, tall and with an air of self-assured arrogance, cleared his throat nervously. Monsieur Poirot, he began, his voice strained, surely you do not suspect any of us. Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly, his gaze never leaving the man. I suspect nothing yet, monsieur. But I have learned that the truth often lies not in what is said, but in what is left unsaid. The man visibly stiffened, his eyes avoiding Poirot's as the detective's gaze lingered on him for a moment longer than was comfortable. Poirot turned to another woman in the room, a striking figure with a cool, calculated demeanor. And you, Madame Fairfax, Poirot said softly, his voice still laced with calm authority. You seem particularly composed. Too composed, perhaps, for someone who has just witnessed such a crime. Her eyes flickered momentarily before she forced a smile. I assure you, Monsieur Poirot, I am simply in shock, as anyone would be. Poirot made no response, merely nodding thoughtfully as he moved toward the door. But his mind was already working, piecing together the reactions he had witnessed. The tightness in the woman's jaw, the coldness in the man's eyes, the way the room's atmosphere shifted when they spoke. He would need to examine them all, one by one, for the smallest inconsistency. But first, he needed to understand the crime itself. The letter. The A. A pattern. A message. Poirot knelt down to inspect the blood-stained floor, his fingers brushing lightly against the crimson letter. His eyes gleamed with insight, though none of it was shared aloud. We shall see, Miss Amos, he murmured to himself. We shall see. Chapter 2. The drawing room was suffused with a quiet tension as Poirot surveyed the group of guests who had gathered in hushed dismay. Their reactions to the murder were as varied as their personalities. Some shaken, some composed, and some, Poirot noted with a keen eye, far too composed. As he moved across the room, his footsteps deliberate on the creaking wooden floor, a feeling of unease hung in the air like a storm cloud. The soft glow of the fireplace cast long shadows, making the faces of the guests seem eerily distorted, as though their fear had been magnified by the flickering light. Poirot's gaze swept over the group, each individual a potential key to the mystery. There was a tall man with a smooth, almost too perfect demeanor, Colonel Reginald St. John, a military man with a hardened exterior, yet his eyes flickered nervously as he caught Poirot's gaze. Nearby, a woman in her early 30s, Madame Fairfax, stood with her back straight, her hands folded neatly in front of her, the picture of composure. But the slight twitch of her lips told a different story. Was it fear, or something more? Poirot's eyes lingered on her for a fraction longer than necessary. There was also Miss Emily Craig, a young woman whose hands trembled slightly as she held a handkerchief to her face, eyes wide in horror. She was the only one who seemed genuinely distraught, but Poirot knew better than to trust appearances. Her shock could easily be a carefully orchestrated act. And then, of course, there was Mr. Arthur Brown, a corpulent man who had made no effort to hide his discomfort. He wiped his brow with an ornate silk handkerchief, the effort of maintaining his composure clearly exhausting him. His eyes darted to the body of Alice Brown, his wife, who lay cold and lifeless on the floor. How strange, Poirot mused, that the husband appeared more disturbed by the presence of the detective than by the murder of his own spouse. The room was heavy with unspoken questions, each face a mask of civility, yet beneath it all was the unmistakable pulse of something darker. Poirot stood before them, his hands clasped behind his back, silently observing the dynamics between them. His mind raced, cataloguing every detail. The way they stood, the glances they exchanged, the mannerisms they displayed. He knew that within this room lay the answers, hidden beneath layers of deception and carefully crafted facades. After a moment of silence, Poirot spoke, his voice calm but firm. "I will need to speak with each of you individually. No one is to leave until I have completed my inquiries." His words were not a suggestion, but an unassailable command. The guests shifted uneasily. The room seemed to constrict with tension, as though the walls themselves were closing in. No one dared to question Poirot's authority. His presence, though unassuming, commanded respect in a way few could ignore. As he turned to face the first guest, Colonel St. John, the others fell into a restless quiet, their eyes following Poirot's every move. "Colonel St. John," Poirot began, his voice as smooth as velvet yet carrying an edge that was impossible to ignore. "Tell me, what is your relationship to the deceased?" The colonel's jaw tightened as he straightened, his posture rigid. "I knew Mrs. Brown for some years, Monsieur Poirot. We shared the same social circle. But I assure you, this is a tragedy, a terrible tragedy. It's all too sudden." His voice faltered slightly, the polished exterior momentarily cracking. Poirot studied him intently, noting the slight twitch in the colonel's fingers as he adjusted his cufflinks. The movement was subtle, but Poirot had seen enough to know that nervousness often revealed itself in such small gestures. "Indeed," Poirot replied, his gaze never leaving the colonel. "A tragedy indeed. But it is also a mystery, Colonel. And in a mystery, every detail matters, every small gesture, every word, and every silence." The colonel's face darkened at the unspoken challenge in Poirot's words. For a moment, it seemed as though the detective had pushed too far, but then the colonel smiled, a tight, controlled smile that did not reach his eyes. "I do not understand what you are implying, monsieur." Poirot merely nodded, his expression unreadable. "We shall see," he murmured. Next, Poirot turned his attention to Madame Fairfax, whose composure was unsettling. She stood poised, but there was an air of calculation in her every movement. As Poirot approached, he observed the coldness in her eyes, the way she tilted her head slightly as if sizing him up. "Madame Fairfax," Poirot began, his tone gentle yet probing, "you seem remarkably calm for someone who has just witnessed such an event." Do you not find the situation unsettling? Her lips curled into a thin smile. I am a woman of strong character, Monsieur Poirot. I've seen much in my time. A murder is indeed shocking, but one must learn to control one's emotions, to focus on what needs to be done. Poirot's eyes flickered with interest. There was something in her words, something rehearsed. Her composure was too perfect, too controlled. As he studied her, he noticed the slight gleam in her eyes, the faintest trace of a hidden agenda beneath the mask of elegance. Indeed, madam, control is a most admirable quality, but control, when pushed too far, can become a prison. Perhaps it is a prison you have built for yourself. Her smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, but Poirot saw it, and he noted it. It was an imperceptible crack in her polished exterior, one that spoke volumes to Poirot's trained eye. He continued his questioning, moving to Miss Emily Craig, whose distress seemed more genuine but no less revealing. Miss Craig, he asked softly, how did you come to be in this room at the time of the murder? The young woman's eyes welled with fresh tears as she wrung her handkerchief. I was in the hallway when I heard the commotion. I rushed in to find Mrs. Brown, like that. Her voice broke, and she seemed to lose herself in her grief for a moment. Poirot watched her closely, his gaze sharp. You were in the hallway. Yet you did not hear any voices, no argument before the event. Miss Craig hesitated, then shook her head. No, only the sound of something heavy being moved, then the scream. Poirot's mind was already processing the information. The lack of a struggle, the lack of noise, what did it mean? He had no immediate answers, but he knew one thing for certain. Miss Craig was hiding something, and it would be in the details that she would eventually reveal the truth. As Poirot moved to question Mr. Arthur Brown, the husband of the deceased, his mind raced. There was something not quite right about the way the guests interacted with one another. The way they looked at one another when they thought he wasn't paying attention. The subtle shifts in their posture. Each one revealed a piece of the puzzle. And Poirot knew, with a certainty that made the hairs on the back of his neck prickle, that this was only the beginning. The pattern of the A.B.C. murders was taking shape, and the deeper he delved into the lives of these suspects, the more he realized that each one of them had something to hide. Chapter 3. The next morning arrived cold and grey, the thick fog rolling in from the Thames, draping London in a cloak of mystery. Poirot sat in his office, the rhythmic tapping of his pen against the desk his only company. His mind, sharp as ever, was consumed with the puzzle of the A.B.C. murders. The night had not brought any immediate revelations, but the pieces of the puzzle were slowly beginning to come together in his mind. He turned the pages of his notebook, reviewing the details of the crime once more. Alice Brown, the first victim, had been found with a letter etched in crimson beside her body. The question remained, why? What was the significance of this letter, and how did it connect to the murder? His mind was consumed by the possibility that this was not just a random act of violence, but the beginning of something much darker, a pattern that would repeat itself again and again. Poirot was pulled from his thoughts by a sharp knock on his door. It was Captain Hastings, his ever-faithful companion, who stepped into the room with a serious expression. "Poirot, we have news," Hastings said, his voice tinged with urgency. "Another body has been discovered. Same as the first, found with a letter B beside it." Poirot's expression did not change, though inside, his mind was already racing. "A letter B?" he repeated softly, his eyes narrowing. "This confirms it. The pattern is real." Hastings nodded, his concern evident. "Yes, but there's more. The body was found in a small town just outside of London. Barnet, I believe. The authorities are convinced this is the work of the same killer, and they're already speculating about the connection." Poirot stood, his sharp gaze never leaving Hastings. Speculation, mon ami, is the enemy of logic. We must approach this case with care, with precision. Let us not be swept up by the frenzy of others. Hastings looked a little sheepish. Of course, Poirot. But the police are already calling it the A.B.C. killer. They believe they have a lead on the whereabouts of the murderer. But Poirot raised a hand, his face serene as always. I will not be distracted by their hasty conclusions, Hastings. The case will be solved through patience, observation, and, most importantly, through understanding the psychology of the criminal. Let us go to Barnet. The two men set out for Barnet, the journey taking them through the foggy, desolate streets of London's outskirts. The air felt colder the further they travelled, and Poirot couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The A.B.C. murders were unfolding too quickly, too neatly. It seemed almost as though the killer wanted them to follow this trail. But why? And where would it lead? Upon arriving in Barnet, Poirot took in the small, sleepy town with its rows of brick houses and quiet streets. It was hard to believe that such a brutal act had occurred here. The second victim had been found in a small alleyway behind a bakery, the letter B scrawled in blood on the cobblestones beside her body. The police had already cordoned off the area, but Poirot could see the small crowd that had gathered, whispering to each other, eager for details. The local constable greeted Poirot and Hastings with a stiff salute. Monsieur Poirot, thank you for coming. We've kept the area secure, but... He hesitated, his eyes shifting nervously. There's something strange about the way the crime scene was arranged. The body was posed, just like the first victim. Poirot's eyes narrowed. The first victim? Alice Brown? He asked, his voice calm but piercing. Yes, sir. And it seems like the killer is leaving a trail of these letters on purpose. They think it's some sort of pattern, A.B.C., you see. Poirot nodded, his thoughts already racing. He was calm, but inside, there was a flicker of uncertainty. This was too obvious, too deliberate. A pattern like this, the A.B.C. pattern, was not random. It was designed to be discovered. And yet, Poirot couldn't shake the feeling that something was being concealed behind the simplicity of the letters. Take me to the scene, Poirot said, his tone measured, yet there was an undercurrent of urgency. He had seen enough to know that false leads were often the most dangerous part of an investigation. The killer, it seemed, was toying with the police, and possibly with Poirot himself. At the crime scene, Poirot crouched beside the body, his trained eyes scanning every detail. The victim, a woman, no older than 25, was lying face up in the alley, her expression frozen in shock. The letter B had been hastily drawn in blood beside her, and there was a subtle but distinct mark on the victim's wrist, as though something had been tied there before she was murdered. Poirot stood, his fingers lightly brushing his mustache as he thought. "This is most interesting," he murmured. "The pattern continues, but there is something here, something that does not quite fit." Hastings, who had been watching from a distance, approached cautiously. "What do you mean, Poirot?" Poirot looked up, his gaze steady and piercing. The first victim, Alice Brown, was found with a letter A. The second victim, this woman, has a letter B, but the manner of their deaths, no. They are not as simple as they seem. The killer is leading us down a path, Hastings. But the path itself may be a deception. Look at this mark on her wrist. It suggests something personal, something between the victim and the killer. Hastings frowned, still confused. But Poirot, the police are already thinking this is the work of a serial killer. Why would the killer be leaving a trail if that were the case? What if this is just what it seems, two murders linked by letters? Poirot smiled faintly, his eyes gleaming with that sharp intensity that so often preceded his brilliant deductions. "You see, my friend, that is where the mistake lies. A serial killer does not leave a clue like this. They do not want to be caught, and they certainly do not want to be understood. But this is not a case of someone trying to remain hidden. This is a game, and the game is just beginning." Chapter 4. The fog had thickened by the time Poirot and Hastings returned to London, the dampness of the air clinging to their clothes as they made their way back through the streets. The silence between them was heavy, a reflection of the dark thoughts each man carried. The A.B.C. murders had escalated, and Poirot's mind churned with the mystery. The pattern was too neat, too deliberate. A killer who played with letters, such a simple, almost childish motif, but Poirot knew better. There was a deeper game at play here, one that required far more than just solving a series of murders. As they entered Poirot's apartment, he went straight to his desk, his mind already formulating his next steps. He stared at the stack of papers before him, each one containing fragments of the case. The victims' names, the letters, the witness statements. Yet, something was missing. Something crucial. Hastings, having removed his coat and sat down, eyed Poirot with concern. "Poirot, I can't help but think we're walking right into the killer's trap. First Alice Brown, then the woman in Barnet. The pattern's obvious, but I feel as if we're missing something. Something the killer is trying to tell us. What's your take?" Poirot's gaze never wavered from the stack of papers. He was silent for a moment, gathering his thoughts. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and deliberate. "The pattern, Hastings, yes. It is far too simple, far too direct. And that, mon ami, is exactly what troubles me. It is a game, a psychological game that the killer is playing with us, and with me. A serial killer would not want to be found. But this one, he wants to be discovered. He wants us to follow the trail he has so carefully laid." Hastings shifted in his seat, leaning forward. "But why? Why would he want us to find him? What's the point of the game?" Poirot turned to face him, his sharp eyes gleaming. "To test us, Hastings. To see if we are clever enough, if we can follow his clues. But there is more to it than that. The letters are a decoy, a smokescreen to draw our attention away from the true nature of the murders. He is not just killing. He is making a statement. The question is, what is the statement?" Before Hastings could respond, Poirot stood abruptly and began pacing around the room, his mind moving faster than his feet. "And there is one more thing, Hastings," he said, his voice quiet but urgent. "The victims themselves, there is a connection between them, something we have not yet uncovered. It is not just their names that tie them together. There is something more personal, something that links them in ways we have not yet seen." Hastings blinked in confusion. "Personal? But they don't seem to have anything in common except for the letters. What do you mean?" Poirot's gaze softened, and he stopped pacing, turning to face Hastings with a look of deep concentration. "I believe, Hastings, that the killer knows his victims. He has a connection to them, one that is hidden beneath the surface. Alice Brown, the first victim, was a socialite, yes, but she was also known to have been involved in a private charity organization. The second victim, the woman in Barnet, worked as a secretary for a law firm. Both of them had lives that were not as simple as they seemed." Hastings nodded slowly, still processing the information. "So, you're saying there's a deeper connection between them, something that ties them together beyond just the letter A and B?" Poirot smiled, his expression tinged with satisfaction. "Exactly, Hastings. And that is where we must focus our attention. We are searching for the murderer, yes, but we must also search for the pattern that links the victims. Only then can we truly begin to understand what the killer is trying to tell us. Just then, Poirot's thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. Hastings went to answer it and returned with a thin envelope in hand. "A letter for you, Poirot. No return address." Poirot took the letter, his brow furrowing slightly. It was unmarked, save for the letter C written in bold, neat handwriting on the front. His pulse quickened as he slit the envelope open with a letter opener and withdrew a single sheet of paper. The note read, "I see you are beginning to understand, Poirot, but there is more to this game than you think. The next victim is already chosen, and the letter will be your only clue. You have been warned. Let the game continue." Poirot stared at the letter, his face a mask of calm, though inside, his mind raced. "So it has begun," he said softly, almost to himself. "The killer has chosen the next victim, and he is taunting me. This is no ordinary case. This is a test of intellect, of deduction. He believes he can outsmart me." Hastings looked at him, alarmed. "What do we do now? How do we stop him?" Poirot smiled, though the smile did not reach his eyes. "We shall play the game, Hastings. But we will not be outwitted. We will follow the clues, yes, but we will also watch the killer's every move. He is too confident. He believes he can control the narrative. But what he does not realize is that I am always one step ahead. Always." Poirot turned to his desk once more, picking up the sheet of paper that the killer had sent him. "The game is far from over," he murmured, his fingers tracing the letter C on the page. "But it is I who will have the final move." Chapter 5. The letter C was the final clue in a game that had been set in motion long before Poirot's arrival. The revelation sent a sharp thrill through his veins, a quiet understanding that this was no ordinary case. This wasn't just about solving a series of murders, it was about unraveling a grand design, a mind that played with intricacies and patterns. Every clue, every action, was meant to bring him to a single point, the killer's final revelation. Poirot sat alone in his office, deep in thought. The fog outside the window had begun to clear, but his mind remained clouded, filled with fragments of evidence and tenuous connections. Hastings had left earlier, on the orders of Poirot, to conduct another round of interviews with the guests from the Brown household. Theories floated in Poirot's mind, but nothing solid yet. One thing was certain: the killer had left a deliberate path, and that path was meant to be followed. The time for conjecture was over. It was time for action. The sound of a sharp knock broke his reverie. Poirot's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing slightly in expectation. As he opened the door, Constable Adams stepped into the room, his face pale and drawn. "Monsieur Poirot," Adams said breathlessly, "another body has been found. Just as you predicted. Same as the others. A letter C." Poirot's expression did not change. He had been expecting this moment. "Lead me to the scene, Constable." The two men made their way quickly through the still crowded streets of London. The fog had been replaced with an eerie stillness, as if the city itself was holding its breath. The crime scene lay near an old theatre in the heart of London, its cobbled streets darkened by the shadows of the evening. Poirot arrived at the scene to find a small crowd gathered, whispering in hushed tones. The police had cordoned off the area, but the tension in the air was palpable. The letter C, written in bright crimson, was scrawled on the pavement next to the body of a man, a late middle-aged fellow dressed in a shabby suit, his face frozen in terror. There was no doubt about it. The pattern had been completed. But the victim was not who Poirot had anticipated. The constable glanced at the body before speaking in a low voice. "This one is different, sir. The man, he's not from around here. Not like the other two. He was a traveling salesman. We found papers in his coat suggesting that he had only been in London for a few days. He didn't seem to have any known connections to the others. Poirot knelt by the body, his eyes scanning every detail with the precision only he possessed. The man's clothes were indeed of poor quality, but there was something else, something even more intriguing. Poirot's sharp eyes focused on the faint indentation on the man's wrist, not unlike the mark found on the previous victim. "Interesting," Poirot murmured. "Very interesting." He rose to his feet, his face betraying nothing, yet his mind was already racing. "There is more to this than we have seen, Constable. The connection between the victims, it is not as simple as we once believed. The letters, yes, but there is another pattern, one hidden in plain sight." The constable looked perplexed. "What do you mean, sir?" Poirot turned to face him, his eyes gleaming with a sharp intensity. "The victims are not random. They are chosen for a reason. The letters are merely the surface. The real clue is much deeper. Each victim shares a mark, a faint impression on their wrist. It is a symbol, not of the killer's violence, but of something more personal, something that binds them together." As Poirot stood, his thoughts rapidly connecting the dots, he turned to Adams. "I need to speak with the families of the victims immediately. There is a link, I am certain of it." The next day, Poirot met with the families and colleagues of the victims. It was a slow process, but each new conversation revealed more pieces of the puzzle. Alice Brown had been part of a small charity that helped children in need. The woman from Barnet had been a secretary, known for her impeccable work ethic and her strict moral code. The salesman, identified as Henry Sims, had recently moved to London from another town, hoping to start fresh, away from the shadows of his past. The more Poirot learned, the more the pattern took shape. These people, despite their differences, were all connected by one thing, their pasts. Each of them, in some way, had wronged someone, an unresolved conflict, a secret buried too deep to surface. But what was the killer's motive? What did this maniac want? Vengeance, perhaps? Or was it something more? Poirot's mind raced as he pieced together the puzzle. It was not simply a random series of murders. The victims had been chosen because of the shadows in their pasts, their lives tangled with others in ways they could never have imagined. But the question remained, who was the killer, and why was he using the letters as a calling card? In the evening, Poirot sat alone in his office, the soft light of the desk lamp illuminating the countless notes and photographs scattered before him. He looked over them again, his sharp eyes scanning for the smallest detail that might have been overlooked. And then, it hit him. An epiphany, a sudden clarity that left him momentarily breathless. The victims had not been chosen randomly. The killer was not targeting people based on their names. He was targeting them based on something far more personal, a pattern tied to the past. The letter C was not the final letter, as they had all assumed. It was the first. It was part of a sequence, but the sequence was not alphabetical. It was personal, specific. Poirot's mind word. The sequence was not about the letters. It was about the order in which the victims had wronged their pasts. The letters were a message, but not a typical one. They were part of a revenge story, one the killer was slowly writing, piece by piece. With this new understanding, Poirot's heart quickened. The game was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. Chapter 6. The fog was thick again the following evening, as if the city itself were conspiring to cloak the investigation in darkness. Poirot sat at his desk, eyes fixed on the array of documents, photographs, and notes scattered in front of him. His fingers hovered over the stack of files, his mind working methodically, sifting through the layers of information he had accumulated. He had spent hours combing through every minute detail of the case, connections between the victims, possible motives, and even the letters they had left behind. The latest victim, Henry Sims, had added a new layer of complexity to the puzzle. His past was more obscure than the others. He had no obvious connections to Alice Brown or the woman in Barnet, yet he had been targeted just the same. The killer's pattern was becoming clearer, but there were still missing pieces. Each victim seemed to have been chosen not only for their past wrongs but also for their proximity to something bigger, a hidden secret that had yet to be revealed. Poirot stood up, walking over to the window and staring out into the misty night. His thoughts whirred. The letters, the victims, the marks on their wrists. There had to be a connection between them, something beyond the obvious. But what was it? What was the killer trying to tell him? His reverie was interrupted by a knock on the door. "Come in," Poirot called, his voice steady. He did not need to turn around to know who it was. Hastings, as always, arrived punctually, though this time there was an unusual urgency in his step. "Poirot, there's something you need to see," Hastings said, his voice strained. He held a small package in his hands, another letter, though this one was wrapped in brown paper and sealed with wax, a stark contrast to the previous taunting notes. Poirot's pulse quickened. Another letter? And this time, sealed. Hastings nodded, handing the letter to Poirot. It was delivered to the office of the local police commissioner. "It's addressed to you." Poirot studied the wax seal for a moment, his fingers tracing the outline of the emblem. It was a symbol he recognized, an old crest, one that had not been in use for decades. He carefully broke the seal and unfolded the letter. The handwriting was elegant, but there was something deliberate about it, as if every stroke of the pen had been chosen with meticulous care. The note read, "I see you've followed my clues, Poirot. You are clever, but not clever enough. The final act is about to unfold." The letter C was but a small part of the story. If you truly wish to understand, you must be prepared for the endgame. I will reveal my final victim, and with it, the last piece of the puzzle. Let the game end on my terms. Poirot's eyes narrowed as he read the words. "This is it," he murmured to himself. The killer was taunting him once more, but there was something in the tone of the letter that struck a chord deep within him. It was clear now that the killer had been one step ahead, leading Poirot toward this final revelation. The game was almost over, but the killer was not finished yet. Hastings looked at him, his face a mixture of confusion and concern. "What does it mean, Poirot? What is he trying to tell us?" Poirot folded the letter carefully and placed it on his desk, his expression calm but intense. "It is the culmination of everything." The letter C was not just a clue, it was the start of the endgame. The killer's message is clear now. The final victim will be someone we have already encountered. Someone who is linked to the others, but who has not yet revealed themselves. Hastings blinked, his mind racing to keep up. "You think the final victim is someone close to the case? Someone we've already spoken to?" Poirot smiled faintly, his eyes glimmering with quiet confidence. "Exactly, mon ami. The killer has been leaving us a trail of breadcrumbs, leading us to this moment. And now, we must find the last piece. The final clue lies not in the victims, but in the connections between them. The killer wants us to understand the full picture, but we must act quickly, for time is running out." The next morning, Poirot and Hastings visited the homes of each victim once more. This time, Poirot's approach was different. He was looking for something more than simple connections between the victims' pasts. He was searching for the final thread that would bind the cases together. He had the sense that the killer's next move would be an act of finality, a calculated conclusion to this twisted game. They arrived at the home of Colonel Reginald St. John, a man who had remained relatively aloof throughout the investigation. Poirot had always felt that St. John was hiding something, but until now, there had been no evidence to support his suspicion. The Colonel's connection to the case had been tenuous at best. He had known Alice Brown through mutual social circles. But beyond that, there was little to suggest he had any deeper ties to the victims. But as Poirot stood in front of the Colonel's house, a nagging feeling grew in the pit of his stomach. He had not yet spoken with St. John privately, and that was a mistake. The Colonel had been too calm throughout the investigation. Too composed. He might hold the key to the puzzle. Poirot rang the doorbell, and after a moment, Colonel St. John appeared, his expression one of polite surprise. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, stepping aside to allow them in. "To what do I owe the honor of this visit?" Poirot's eyes studied him carefully as he entered the house. "I have been reflecting on the case, Colonel. You are, of course, familiar with the other victims, but I have yet to hear much about your personal connection to them. I would like to ask you a few questions, if you don't mind." St. John's expression faltered for the briefest moment, an imperceptible twitch, but enough to give Poirot pause. "Of course, Monsieur Poirot," he said smoothly. "Ask away." Poirot seated himself in the drawing-room, his gaze never leaving the Colonel. "You were a close friend of Alice Brown, yes? And I understand you have some acquaintance with Miss Fairfax and others from the social circles you frequent. But tell me, Colonel, do you know anything about the mark found on the victim's wrists?" St. John's face remained impassive, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of something, an emotion too fleeting to catch. "I cannot say that I do, Monsieur Poirot. I am not a doctor, after all." Poirot's gaze never wavered as he leaned forward slightly. "No, Colonel, you are not a doctor. But I have noticed something very particular about you. You are a man who thrives on control. And I believe the killer shares your need for control. The letter C, it is not just a clue. It is a symbol. A symbol of something personal. Perhaps it is a symbol of something you have yet to reveal." St. John's expression hardened, and for the first time, the veneer of composure cracked. "I do not know what you are insinuating, Poirot," he said, his voice growing colder. "But if you think for one moment that I have any involvement in this—" Poirot raised a hand, cutting him off with a calm yet commanding gesture. "I am not accusing you, Colonel. I am simply stating that the final piece of the puzzle lies in your hands. You know something. You always have." The Colonel took a step back, his face taut with frustration. "I have nothing to say to you, Monsieur Poirot." Poirot stood, his sharp gaze still fixed on the Colonel. "I believe you do, and I will not rest until I hear it. For the sake of the victims, for the sake of this game, you will reveal your part in it." Chapter 7. The early morning light broke through the persistent fog that had cloaked London for days, casting a muted glow over the city's grey streets. Poirot stood at the window of his office, his eyes focused on the distant horizon. The silence in the room was deep, broken only by the soft sound of the ticking clock on his desk. His mind, however, was anything but silent. It was racing with the final pieces of the puzzle that had been set in motion with the death of Alice Brown, and which had now escalated with the discovery of the third victim, Henry Sims. After days of tense investigation, questioning, and analyzing the connections between the victims, Poirot finally had his answer. The clues had led him to the heart of the mystery, and now it was time for him to reveal the truth, to expose the face of the murderer. Hastings, who had been quiet for some time, entered the office, his face showing signs of weariness. The strain of the investigation had begun to take its toll on him, but Poirot noticed something else in his friend's eyes, a sense of anticipation, an eagerness for the case to reach its conclusion. "Poirot," Hastings began, his voice carrying a note of tension, "you have been quiet for some time now. Do you know who the killer is? Have you figured it out?" Poirot turned to face him, his gaze steady and resolute. Yes, Hastings. I believe I know exactly who the killer is. It has been clear to me for some time, but the pieces of the puzzle have finally fallen into place. The time for subtlety is over. The truth must come to light. With a firm step, Poirot walked to his desk and picked up the stack of papers. He looked at each one, the photographs of the victims, the notes left by the killer, the small details that no one else had seen but him. He had been right all along. The A.B.C. pattern had been a deliberate decoy, a distraction, hiding the true motive behind the murders. "It is time to bring the truth to the others," Poirot said, his voice calm yet filled with an undeniable intensity. "I will need to gather everyone, the suspects, the families, and anyone who may hold a key to the mystery. We must uncover the final piece." Later that evening, Poirot called together the remaining suspects and those connected to the case. He had arranged for a private gathering at a large, quiet estate just outside London. The room was carefully prepared, dimly lit, the large windows shut to ensure no interruptions. Poirot's guests arrived one by one, each carrying their own mixture of fear, confusion, and curiosity. They had all been suspects at one point or another, and now, the time had come for Poirot to unveil the truth. Colonel St. John entered first, his posture stiff, his face unreadable. Miss Fairfax followed shortly after, her cool demeanor still intact, but Poirot could detect the faintest shift in her eyes as she stepped into the room. Behind her, Miss Craig entered, looking more fragile than before, her eyes red from the constant strain. Finally, Mr. Arthur Brown, the grieving widower, entered last, his face a mask of stoic sorrow. Poirot had instructed them to sit, and as they settled into their chairs, he stood at the head of the room, his hands clasped behind his back. "Monsieur, Madame," Poirot began, his voice steady but commanding. "You are all here tonight because, for some time now, I have been observing you. Each of you holds a piece of this puzzle, whether you realize it or not. And now, the moment has arrived. The game ends tonight." The room was tense, all eyes fixed on Poirot. The guests exchanged uneasy glances, waiting for him to continue. "The first victim, Alice Brown," Poirot continued, his gaze sweeping over the room, "was an innocent woman in many respects. Yet, her life was tangled with secrets, just as the others were. You all believe the murders were random, a series of coincidences connected only by their names, but you are mistaken. The murders were not about the letters. No, they were about something deeper, something far more personal." He paused, letting his words sink in. The room was silent, save for the occasional shifting of feet. "Each of you," Poirot said, his voice growing softer, "had a connection to one of the victims, a past that was not as innocent as it appeared. And it was this connection that led to their deaths. But there was one among you who held the power to orchestrate this all, one who used the letters to confuse us, to mislead us." The guests stiffened. Poirot's words were like a knife, cutting through their composure. "I will not keep you in suspense any longer," Poirot said, his voice now clear and sharp. "The killer is none other than Colonel Reginald St. John." A gasp escaped from Miss Craig, and even Miss Fairfax's cool exterior faltered for a brief moment. Poirot continued, his gaze fixed on the Colonel, who had grown pale. "You see, Colonel, you had the most to hide. You were not just a man of high society. You were deeply involved in the charity work of Alice Brown, and you had a personal vendetta against her. She had been the one to expose your involvement in an embezzlement scheme years ago. You knew that if the truth came to light, your reputation would be destroyed. But Alice Brown was not your only problem. The others, Miss Fairfax, Mr. Brown, they, too, knew pieces of your secret. And when the first victim was killed, you thought the game had ended. But no, the game was just beginning. The colonel stood up abruptly, his face twisted in anger. "You don't know what you're talking about. This is preposterous." Poirot's gaze remained unwavering. "You killed Alice Brown to protect yourself, but when the others started to ask questions, you had no choice but to silence them, too. The letters were a smokescreen. You thought we would focus on the pattern, the A.B.C. But the truth was right in front of us the whole time. You wanted us to look for a larger conspiracy, to follow the trail of your little game. But the real truth was that you were the one who was hiding in plain sight." The room was silent, the weight of Poirot's words settling over the group like a heavy fog. Colonel St. John's face was a mask of rage, his hands trembling. "You're lying," he spat, his voice cracking. "I'm not the killer." Poirot's eyes softened, but his voice was firm. "No, Colonel. I am not lying. You are the murderer. You killed to protect yourself from exposure, and in doing so, you played a game with us, one that you thought you could win." St. John's posture collapsed as the realization hit him. His shoulders slumped, and he sank back into his chair, defeated. His head fell into his hands. Poirot turned to the others in the room. The killer's motive was not a simple desire for death. It was a need to protect a carefully crafted lie. Chapter 8. The room fell into a heavy silence as Poirot's words lingered in the air, settling like a thick fog. Colonel St. John, once the epitome of control and composure, now sat slumped in his chair, his face a pale mask of disbelief. He had been exposed, and the truth was undeniable. The final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. Poirot stood at the head of the room, his gaze fixed on the colonel. The calmness in his eyes was unshakable, but the intensity of his presence was undeniable. The others, Miss Fairfax, Miss Craig, and Mr. Brown, were still processing the shock of the revelation. Each of them had been drawn into the web of deception, their lives intertwined with the colonel's in ways they could not have predicted. For a long moment, no one spoke. The weight of Poirot's words hung heavily over the group, the truth still settling like a stone dropped into a still pond. It was Miss Fairfax who finally broke the silence. "But why?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why kill them? Alice and the others?" Poirot turned to face her, his gaze thoughtful. "It was not simply a desire for murder, madam. No, it was far more complicated. Colonel St. John killed Alice Brown to silence her, to prevent her from exposing his past crimes. But when the others began to ask questions, when they started to piece together his lies, he felt he had no choice but to eliminate them as well. It was a matter of survival for him. His career, his reputation, all were at stake. Hastings, still standing off to the side, looked at Poirot in disbelief. "But the letters, Poirot. The letters were so deliberate, so calculated. Why the A.B.C. pattern? It seemed like such an intricate game." Poirot smiled faintly, his eyes softening. "Ah, yes, Hastings. The A.B.C. pattern. It was a game, indeed. A game that Colonel St. John played to distract us, to make us focus on the letters and not the real motive. The letters were meant to create confusion, to make us believe we were dealing with a random series of murders. But they were not random. They were calculated, and each one was carefully chosen to mislead us, to keep us focused on the surface while he hid the deeper, more personal reason for his actions." The colonel, his head still buried in his hands, slowly raised his gaze. His eyes were filled with a mixture of anger and resignation. "You don't understand," he said, his voice hoarse. "You don't know what it was like. I had everything to lose. Alice, she was going to ruin me. And the others, they would have done the same. You think I wanted to kill them? I had no choice." Poirot took a step forward, his gaze steady and unyielding. "You had a choice, Colonel. We all have choices. And you chose to protect your secrets with blood. You chose to play a dangerous game, and now you must face the consequences of your actions. The Colonel's expression hardened. I did what I had to do. Poirot shook his head, his voice soft but filled with authority. No, Colonel. You did what you wanted to do. You chose to kill, to deceive, to lie. And now, the truth has come to light. The room remained silent as Poirot's words hung in the air. The Colonel's fate had been sealed, but the repercussions of his actions would reverberate far beyond the walls of the room. As Poirot stood in front of the Colonel, he knew that justice would be served. But justice, as he well understood, was not always a simple thing. It came with a price. The sound of approaching footsteps broke the silence. The door to the room opened, and a group of police officers stepped inside. The lead officer, a man with a stern face and sharp eyes, approached Poirot. Monsieur Poirot, the officer said, nodding respectfully. The suspect is in custody, as you instructed. Poirot nodded, his expression unchanging. Take him away, he said simply. The law will handle the rest. As the officers led the Colonel out of the room, Poirot turned to the others. His gaze softened, but there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. I know this has been a difficult experience for all of you. But know this, justice has been served. The killer has been unmasked, and the truth is now in the open. The puzzle has been solved. Miss Fairfax stood, her face pale but resolute. I still can't understand it, she said quietly. How could someone like him, a man we all respected, could do something so monstrous? Poirot looked at her, his eyes filled with understanding. Monstrous acts do not always come from monstrous men. Sometimes, they come from those who hide their darkness behind a mask of respectability. Colonel St. John was a man of many faces, and it was those faces that deceived us all. As Poirot, Hastings, and the others left the room, the weight of the investigation began to lift. The fog that had shrouded the city had finally begun to clear, but there was no sense of triumph in Poirot's heart. Justice had been done, but at what cost? The lives of the victims could not be returned, and the scars left by the killer's actions would remain forever. Poirot and Hastings walked slowly through the now clear streets of London. Hastings was the first to speak, his voice thoughtful. Poirot, it's over. The case is solved. But do you feel satisfied? Poirot glanced at him, a small smile playing at the corner of his lips. Satisfaction. Hastings? It is a rare thing, indeed. No, I do not feel satisfied. I feel weary. Weary of the darkness that lies hidden in the hearts of men. But we must move forward, for that is the only thing we can do. Hastings nodded, his thoughts mirroring Poirot's. You're right, Poirot. It's over now. Poirot's eyes gazed ahead, his mind already turning to the next case, the next puzzle that awaited him. Yes, Hastings. But there will always be more puzzles, more mysteries to solve. And we must be ready. The two men walked on, their steps in sync, the quiet of the city enveloping them once more. The A.B.C. murders were behind them, but the shadows of the past still loomed large. Poirot knew that he would continue to seek out the truth, no matter how deep the darkness ran. Chapter 9. The sun had barely risen when Poirot found himself once again in his apartment, a soft haze of morning light filling the room. The investigation had concluded, the killer unmasked, and the final pieces of the puzzle now in place. Yet, despite the success, Poirot could not shake the sense of weariness that clung to him like a shadow. Justice had been served, yes, but the price had been steep, and the faces of the victims lingered in his mind. As he sipped his coffee, the steam curling from the cup and dissipating into the stillness of the room, his thoughts turned inward. The A.B.C. murders, though solved, had revealed something far darker, something that had always lurked beneath the surface of this elegant society. The Colonel's actions, while shocking, were not entirely surprising. People, Poirot had learned long ago, were capable of unimaginable things when their self-interest was at stake. Yet, the complexity of the pattern, the psychological depth of the game the killer had orchestrated, made it one of the most challenging cases he had faced in recent years. Hastings had been quiet since the conclusion of the investigation. He had always been the more optimistic of the two, yet even he seemed subdued by the weight of the events that had unfolded. Poirot knew that the shadows of the case had touched them both in ways that would be hard to forget. But for Poirot, it was not just the victims or the killer that weighed heavily on him. It was the reminder of how fragile the line between order and chaos could be. How easily a person could slip into darkness when pushed by their fears, their regrets, or their secrets. The ringing of the telephone broke his reverie, and Poirot picked up the receiver with the precision he always used in moments of focus. "Poirot speaking," he said, his voice calm and steady, though his mind remained elsewhere. "Monsieur Poirot, I hope I'm not disturbing you," came the voice on the other end. It was the local police commissioner, and Poirot instantly knew that the conversation would not be about congratulatory praise for his work. "No disturbance, mon ami," Poirot replied smoothly, his thoughts snapping back into focus. "How may I assist you?" "The case has been wrapped up, of course, but there's one matter I thought you should know about. The families of the victims, particularly Miss Fairfax, have expressed their gratitude, but there's a sense of unease in the air. People are wondering how this could have happened in such a seemingly perfect circle of acquaintances. It seems that the shadow of the Colonel's crimes still lingers over them. There's no real peace yet, even with the truth revealed." Poirot paused, considering the words. "The truth, my dear Commissioner, is never as simple as it appears on the surface. While justice has been served, the human cost of the case cannot be so easily measured." The police commissioner sighed, his voice lowering. "I understand. It's just the faces of the victims, their families. It all feels like a nightmare that no one can wake up from. People are looking to you for more than just answers. They're looking for closure. They want something to bring peace." Poirot closed his eyes for a moment, allowing the weight of the conversation to settle over him. "Peace," he repeated softly. "Perhaps peace is a luxury that none of us can afford in such cases. But closure, monsieur, that I can offer. And I will." After a brief exchange, Poirot hung up the phone, his thoughts heavy. It was true. The case was not truly over. The resolution, though logically sound, was only the first step toward healing for those affected by the murders. The psychological wounds would take longer to heal. The families would need time to find peace in the aftermath of such a tragic series of events. He rose from his desk and walked over to the window, looking out at the bustling city below. People moved in every direction, their lives continuing, unaware of the dark secrets that had recently unfolded in their midst. Poirot had learned that even in the most seemingly perfect circles, darkness could thrive, quietly lurking just beneath the surface. A faint knock on the door interrupted his thoughts, and Poirot turned, recognizing the sound of familiar footsteps. Hastings entered, his face softer than before. He gave Poirot a small, hesitant smile. "I thought I'd find you here," Hastings said, taking a seat by the desk. "I was just thinking about the case, about the way it ended. The Colonel seemed so ordinary. It's hard to reconcile the man we knew with the monster he became." Poirot nodded slowly, his eyes distant. "Indeed, Hastings. Sometimes the most dangerous criminals are those who blend into society, hiding their true selves behind masks of respectability. Colonel St. John had built a facade of honor and decency, but it was all a lie. It is a bitter truth that I have come to understand over the years. Sometimes, the most shocking crimes come from those we least expect. Hastings sat back, his expression thoughtful. I understand, Poirot. But I can't help but feel like this case changed something in me. It made me question how well we ever really know anyone. Poirot's gaze softened, and he placed a hand gently on Hastings's shoulder. That is a question we all must ask ourselves, Hastings. How well do we truly know those around us? The answer, I fear, is rarely as clear as we wish. There was a long silence between them, filled only by the distant sounds of the city. Finally, Hastings spoke again, his voice quieter this time. Do you think it's possible, Poirot, to ever really understand the people we encounter? Or do we only see what they want us to see? Poirot thought for a moment before responding, his voice tinged with a rare trace of vulnerability. Perhaps, mon ami, we see only fragments of them, pieces, small glimpses. But the whole truth, the entire picture, that is something we rarely know. We are not meant to know all of it. People are complex, unpredictable. And sometimes, the greatest mystery lies in understanding our own hearts. The two men sat together in silence, the weight of the case and its aftermath hanging between them. Poirot knew that the road to closure was long and often painful. But even in the face of darkness, he could still find peace in knowing that justice had been done, and that the truth had been brought to light. Chapter 10. Days passed in a quiet blur after the resolution of the case. The fog that had hung over London for weeks finally lifted, but the weight of the A.B.C. murders remained, lingering like a shadow in the minds of all involved. Poirot had done what he did best, solved the puzzle, uncovered the truth, and brought justice. Yet, as he sat in his apartment in the stillness of the morning, there was an undeniable sense of quiet melancholy in his heart. He had expected closure to feel different, perhaps a sense of satisfaction or a triumph over the darkness. Instead, what lingered was a quiet, almost sorrowful reflection on the lives lost and the facades that had crumbled. The mind of the killer, Colonel St. John, had been laid bare, and yet the human cost of his actions was something that no one, least of all Poirot, could escape. Poirot sat with a cup of coffee in his hand, staring out the window at the sun rising over the city, casting a soft light over the streets. His mind, though quieter now, was still working, still turning over the events, searching for deeper meanings, for lessons that had been learned, and perhaps some that still needed to be learned. There was a knock at the door, and Poirot, as always, responded with his usual politeness. "Come in," he called, setting down his coffee with careful precision. Hastings entered, his face more relaxed than it had been in days. He carried with him a bundle of newspapers, a look of resolve in his eyes. "I thought you might want to see this, Poirot," Hastings said, handing over the papers. "It's about the case, the final report from the police, and some of the reactions from the families of the victims. They're still processing everything, as expected. But there's something else too, a reflection on your methods, your approach." Poirot took the papers with a gentle nod, scanning through them. There were articles about the resolution of the case, some reporting on Colonel St. John's trial, others discussing the psychological intricacies of the murders. It was clear that Poirot's approach, his focus on the psychology of the killer rather than just the evidence, had intrigued many. The press hailed him as a master of deduction once more, but it was the quiet words from the families that caught his attention. "They all seem to appreciate what you've done, Poirot," Hastings said, watching his friend closely. "They're still grieving, of course, but there's a sense of relief too. I think they finally feel like they can begin to heal." Poirot smiled softly, a trace of sadness in his eyes. "Relief, yes," he said quietly. "But relief, Hastings, is often the illusion of closure. In truth, it is only a temporary balm. The wounds left by such events are not easily healed. And for the families, it will take much more than just justice to mend their hearts. Hastings nodded, understanding the depth of Poirot's words. The two men were silent for a moment, both lost in thought, before Hastings spoke again. "I've been thinking about something you said the other day, Poirot. About how justice doesn't always feel like a victory. About how we see only fragments of people and that the whole truth is often beyond our grasp." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "And what have you concluded from these reflections, mon ami?" Hastings hesitated for a moment, but then smiled, a small, thoughtful smile. "I think I understand what you meant. People, they wear so many masks. And it's only in moments like this, when the truth finally comes out, that we get a glimpse of who they really are. But even then, it's never the full picture. We're all just doing the best we can, aren't we? Trying to make sense of things, trying to move forward." Poirot nodded, his eyes warm as he looked at Hastings. "You are correct, Hastings. We are all, in our way, searching for answers. But sometimes, the answers are not as simple as we wish them to be. They are complex, layered with emotions, histories, and choices that define us in ways we may never fully understand." Hastings let out a breath, as though a weight had been lifted. "I think I finally get it. The work you do, it's not just about solving the case. It's about understanding people. Their fears, their motivations, their pain." "Exactly," Poirot said, a slight smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "To understand the human heart is the greatest puzzle of all." There was a long silence between them, a quiet understanding that lingered in the room. Poirot turned back to the window, his thoughts drifting once more to the faces of the victims, the killer, and the families left behind. Justice had been served, but the world had not become any less complicated in the process. Perhaps, he thought, that was the essence of the work he did. Not just to solve crimes, but to offer some clarity in a world that was full of shadows. "I suppose, Poirot, that means you're going to be off to your next case soon?" Hastings asked, breaking the silence once again. Poirot turned, his eyes twinkling slightly with that familiar glint of excitement. "Always, mon ami. There is always another puzzle to solve, another mystery to uncover. But for now, we take our leave of this one. It is done, and there is nothing more to be done. It is time to let it rest." Hastings smiled, nodding in agreement. "And what do you think about the next case, Poirot? Will it be as complicated as this one?" Poirot paused for a moment, his gaze thoughtful. "Ah, Hastings, if only we knew. The future is always full of mysteries. But that, my friend, is what makes life interesting, non." As they stood up, preparing to leave the apartment, Poirot turned once more to the window, his eyes reflecting the soft glow of the setting sun. The A.B.C. murders were behind them, but as he had said before, there would always be more cases, more puzzles to solve. And as long as he had his little grey cells, Poirot would never stop searching for the answers. Thanks so much for joining me on this mysterious journey today. I hope you enjoyed unraveling the twists and turns with me. If you liked what you heard, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. And if you're new, hit that subscribe button so you never miss an eerie tale. And as always, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let's keep the mystery alive. Until next time, keep wondering, keep questioning, and most importantly, keep enjoying the mysteries that lie in the moonlight. See you in the next one.